Hey guys, so dim the lights, sink into the pillow, and let your brain loosen just a little. Tonight's bedtime history stroll is not about kings and queens directly, but about what they, and the societies around them, thought counted as medicine. And yes, this does involve bones. Human bones. In a cup, because of course it does. You see, medieval Europe had this long-running fascination with death. Cemeteries weren't quiet, private places tucked away in the suburbs like today. They were smack in the middle of the city, like community gardens, except instead of roses and carrots you got piles of skulls and femurs politely tucked against the church wall. So it's not shocking. Well, it is, but pretend it's not. That people decided, hey, maybe we should drink some of this. The practice had a name, mumia. No, not like the Brendan Fraser movie. This was ground-up body parts, usually bones or dried flesh, consumed as medicine. Doctors swore by it, apothecaries stocked it, and aristocrats who could afford the good stuff thought it was basically a health tonic. Imagine being a duke with gout and your physician offers you a prescription of, quote, powdered skull. That's not a punchline. That's a Tuesday. The reasoning was very medieval. Bones were thought to contain the life force of the person they came from. Grind them up, swallow them down, and congratulations, you just borrowed someone else's vitality. It was basically ancient Red Bull, if Red Bull also came with a whiff of grave dirt and moral unease. But here's where it gets even more bizarre. The bones weren't always local. Some came from far-off lands because, of course, importing exotic body parts was classier. A bit of North African mummy dust? Trace chic. Apothecaries in Paris and London sold it like fine spices. Madam, would you like a pinch of cinnamon? Or a teaspoon of ground-up farro? The fact that these mummies were being stolen, hacked apart, and shipped across the sea didn't seem to bother anyone much. In fact, the more ancient and foreign the corpse, the more powerful they assumed it was. And then we get to the nobility who adored this stuff. Think about Charles II of England, for instance. Though technically we're skipping a few centuries forward, he was so enthusiastic about the whole bone as medicine idea that he had his own concoction called the King's Drops. It was literally made with powdered human skull, and he sipped it like fine wine, because when you're the ruler of a shaky monarchy, why not add cannibalism to the resume? But even before Charles II, medieval monarchs were on board. They believed bones had curative powers for everything from headaches to epilepsy. Some even thought that rubbing powdered bone into a wound would speed healing, which, in the most ironic sense possible, was true, because the powder was sometimes mixed with wine, and at least the alcohol would numb the pain. A medieval win-win, if you will. Let's float gently toward another detail here. Not all bones were equal. The skull, in particular, was considered premium medicine. If you could snag the skull of someone who died violently, say executed on the scaffold, that was thought to be even better. Why? Because their life force had been cut short. Their essence was still buzzing around inside, like an unfinished energy drink. So naturally, grinding that up and drinking it would give you a real kick. Of course, the reality was less glamorous. Most of this mumia sold in shops was not actually ancient mummy or fresh criminal skull. It was just bones. Random bones, sometimes dug up from cemeteries, sometimes scraped off charnel houses, sometimes faked with resin or dirt. The medieval supply chain was, let's just call it sketchy, but people bought it anyway, because nothing says good health like swallowing mystery powder from a jar labeled authentic Egyptian. And while all this sounds deeply macabre to us, to medieval elites, it was just another treatment option. Like how today you might choose between herbal tea and melatonin, back then the choice was between willow bark and, well, Aunt Gertrude's femur. So, tuck yourself in and let's drift forward now to see how this odd medical craze grew and why people kept insisting that sipping on ground-up bones was the height of sophistication. So, we've already tucked ourselves into the cozy, slightly morbid world of powdered skulls and imported mummy dust. Let's keep floating down this strange medicinal river. Because medieval people weren't content with just eating bones. No. They found new, creative, sometimes surprisingly enthusiastic ways to apply them. One favorite method was mixing bone powder with wine. Of course, everything went into wine. If you had a fever, your doctor might say, Take 2 teaspoons of skull, stir it into claret, and call me in the morning. And people did. Because in a time when water could literally make you sick, wine was safer. And if you believe the advertising, bones gave it a supernatural upgrade. Basically, a medieval cocktail with a garnish of mortality. Now, you might be wondering, was this actually good for anyone? The short answer, not really. The long answer, people swore it was. Rich nobles and kings would pay ridiculous sums for a vial of authentic powdered skull. And like all overpriced health fads, the placebo effect probably did the heavy lifting. If you believe a drink of ground-up skeleton will cure your migraines, chances are you'll at least feel a little better. But let's talk about the source again. Because who decided which bones made the cut? Well, some physicians argued that young bones were best. Fresh, full of life force, not too dried out. Others insisted the bones of saints had extra punch. Imagine kneeling at a shrine, praying for healing, and then politely asking the custodian if you could scrape off a piece of Saint whoever's femur for your medicine cabinet. The medieval church wasn't thrilled about this idea, but people found ways. Relics went missing, pieces chipped off statues, and suspiciously ended up in powdered form behind the apothecary's counter. And then there's the ever-charming idea of human fat. Not bones, but close enough to stay on theme. Some healers claimed that rubbing fat from executed criminals onto your skin could cure joint pain. Yes, you heard that right. If your knees ached, someone out there thought a little human candle wax would do the trick. This was not niche. Recipes for it show up in actual medical texts. Europeans weren't squeamish, they were practical, at least in their own peculiar way. Still, bones remained the superstar. They had this aura of permanence, of strength. People thought that by consuming the hardest, most durable part of the human body, they could borrow that toughness, which makes a weird, sort of poetic sense if you're squinting in the candlelight and trying not to gag. Let's float now toward the royalty again. Because of course kings and queens weren't skipping this fad. They were trendsetters. And the more expensive and exotic a treatment was, the more they loved it. Some monarchs even traveled with their own private supply of bone powder, like a portable vitamin stash. It was fashionable. It was exclusive. And it was delightfully gruesome. The irony here is that while elites were sipping bone cocktails to strengthen their fragile bodies, their actual health problems usually came from inbreeding, poor diet, and general medieval hygiene, or lack thereof. No amount of skull-flavored wine was going to cure gout when dinner was still roasted swan stuffed with pastry. But the belief lingered, because it was easier to trust in mystical powders than to admit that maybe eating vegetables once in a while would help. By the late Middle Ages, the trade in human bones was so widespread that it became a sort of shadow economy. Apothecaries imported not just mummies from Egypt, but also bones looted from catacombs, cemeteries, and battlefields. The 30 Years' War, for instance, left so many corpses lying around that entrepreneurial types scooped up bones and sold them to pharmacies. Picture it. A soldier dies in muddy armor, and a few years later his femur ends up as somebody's digestive aid in a German market. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Some physicians rolled their eyes and said the whole practice was nonsense. But, as with most health trends, skepticism doesn't sell nearly as well as a miracle cure. So bones kept being bottled, sold, and swallowed. And that brings us to the calmest, most bedtime-friendly irony of all. While medieval Europe was grinding up the dead for medicine, the actual science of anatomy was just barely crawling forward. People were afraid of dissecting corpses for study, but somehow had no problem eating them. Because priorities. So, if you're lying there in bed right now, listening to this slow drift through history, just be glad your nightly health routine involves chamomile tea or maybe a gummy vitamin, and not a spoonful of Uncle Harold. And with that thought, let's glide into the final stretch of this peculiar history, how long this bone-drinking craze lasted, and why it eventually, mercifully, fell out of style. So, we've sipped our way through skull-infused wine, saint-flavored powders, and battlefield to apothecary supply chains. Let's slowly float toward the end of this peculiar chapter in medical history, the part where people finally began to rethink whether munching on Uncle Harold's femur was the best way to cure a headache. The fashion for bone medicine lasted well into the Renaissance and even tiptoed into the early modern period. You'd think the Enlightenment, with all its shiny new microscopes and budding rationalism, would have killed the trend. But no, even some of the brightest minds were on board. Francis Bacon, for example, the grand philosopher of science himself, once recommended consuming mummy powder as a cure. If that doesn't make you want to sigh deeply into your pillow, nothing will. By the 16th and 17th centuries, this practice had become not just mainstream but ritzy. Apothecaries sold fancy jars labeled mumia vera, which translates to true mummy, because when your product is ethically questionable, slapping the word true on it obviously makes it more trustworthy. These jars were often filled with whatever dusty bones happened to be lying around. But customers, dukes, duchesses, even kings, bought it with gusto. And yes, this brings us back to Charles II of England again. He didn't just dabble. He was basically the Gwyneth Paltrow of corpse medicine. His King's Drops were marketed as a universal elixir, strength, energy, long life, the whole medieval self-care package. He guzzled the stuff. Did it help him? Not really. He still died of kidney failure at 54. So much for the healing power of human skulls. But Charles wasn't alone. Across Europe, powdered skull was given to epileptics, in the belief that it could calm seizures. Fresh blood, yes, blood, was sometimes drunk directly at public executions. Spectators would rush forward, cup in hand, because the life force was thought to still be warm and potent. Imagine the scene. A man's head falls, the crowd cheers, and then a few enterprising patients elbow their way in with little goblets. All in the name of health. Now, at this point you might be asking, when did people finally stop? The answer is, frustratingly, not until the 18th century. As medical science slowly gained ground, the idea of eating the dead began to look a little awkward. Anatomical studies were showing how the human body actually worked. Chemistry was uncovering the difference between myth and measurable reality. And the Enlightenment was teaching Europeans to be slightly less obsessed with mystical body parts. But like any wellness fad, it didn't vanish overnight. Old habits lingered. Some country healers kept prescribing bone powder well into the 1700s. And traces of the trade in mummies and bones kept circulating, tucked between jars of herbs and spices in dusty shops. Only with the rise of modern medicine, real science, germ theory, actual chemistry, did the bone craze quietly fade into history. Looking back, it's easy to roll our eyes. Drinking bones? Eating dried flesh? Smearing fat onto sore knees? Ridiculous. But then, every era has its health fads. Medieval nobles had skull wine. The Victorians had arsenic beauty tonics. We have detox teas and jade rollers. Give it a few centuries and people will laugh at our wellness obsessions too. So, tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the thought settle gently. History is less about progress and more about repetition. Humans always want the shortcut, the miracle, the thing in a bottle. Whether it's crushed bones, powdered plants, or lab-made supplements, the desire never changes. Just the packaging does. And with that, we close the dusty jar on medieval bone medicine. Rest easy, knowing your bedtime drink of choice is probably chamomile and not skull-flavored Merlot. Good night.